This is part two of the PowerPoint on the early republic. Most of the founders of the United States hated the idea of political parties. They thought they were divisive, that they were made up by factions, in other words, one group of people, one clique of people that opposed others, and they didn't believe that a republic should be governed by groups. They believed it should be governed by free, independent individuals. And when they set up the system for electing a president and vice president, they assumed that there would be no parties, just individuals. And we'll see that that caused a problem in the election of 1800. Now, the first two political parties that developed were the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalist Party no longer exists, and neither does the other party. These are not modern Democrats or modern Republicans. Uh, it this was a party headed by Thomas Jefferson that's sometimes just called Republicans, sometimes Jeffersonian Republicans, sometimes Democratic Republicans, but these don't correspond to our current political parties. The Federalists were led by Alexander Hamilton, and George Washington was a Federalist, although he didn't like to use that term. Um, and the Democratic Republicans were led by Thomas Jefferson. Um, Federalists believed in a strong federal government. Uh, the Democratic Republicans believed in a weak federal government. The issue here was that a lot of the Federalists had served in the Continental Army in the Revolution, and they saw the problems with a weak central government. They couldn't operate the war very successfully at times. It was too weak, and they wanted it to be stronger. The attitude of Jefferson and his party was that we'd fought a revolution for freedom, and that if we have a strong central government that's a distance away, then we lose that freedom. So those are two very different points of view. The Federalists emphasized power and security, the stability of the government. The Democratic Republicans emphasized liberty and states' rights. They wanted the states to have more power than the federal government. The Federalists embodied the spirit of 1787, which is when the Constitution was written, which created a strong federal government. The Democratic Republicans look back to the spirit of 76, the time of the Declaration of Independence, and the rebellion against the tyranny of a distant central government in Britain. Federalists favored the Bank of the United States. They thought it was necessary to build the economy. The other party was against it. They thought that the Constitution did not give the federal government the power to create it. They disagreed on that point, and they saw this as an institution that would have too much power. Now, the Federalists tended to believe in what's called a loose construction of the Constitution. In Article 1, Section 8, there is a clause that says the government may do anything which is that Congress may do anything which is necessary and proper to carry out its other powers under the Constitution. And since Congress has the power to regulate interstate trade and commerce, and foreign trade and commerce, they thought that creating a bank was constitutional, was consistent with the Constitution, because it was necessary and proper to do these other things. The Democratic Republicans were strict constructionists. They said, we've looked down the list here and we don't see the power to create a bank. It's not enumerated. It's not one of the numbers. And therefore, we don't think Congress has the power to do this. And this disagreement continues to the present day, not over a bank these days, but over other powers that the federal government has. the question is do we interpret the Constitution loosely? Do we consider it a living document, or do we interpret it strictly? Uh, the Federalists were generally more favorable to the British, and they hated the French Revolution because that represented chaos. The Jeffersonian Republicans uh, favored the French Revolution because it was a move in the direction of liberty as they saw it. So there are all sorts of emotional dividing lines between these two parties. Generally, the Federalists were favored by business and the elites in northern cities, bankers, for example, and the Jefferson's party by Southerners and rural people, farmers. There were also divisions over foreign policy. There was a war on between Britain and France following the beginning of the French Revolution. Uh, there was a lot of anger toward Britain going back to the revolution itself, but also because the British were attacking American shipping to the French West Indies. Britain and France were superpowers. The United States was a small country, and they both felt entirely free to interfere with American shipping if it served their own interests. Uh, Britain also impressed American sailors, but that word impressment has a specific meaning. It meant it forced them to go into the British Navy because they still saw them as citizens of Britain, and they felt free to simply take them into the British Navy on the high seas, capturing them from American ships. This provoked tremendous anger in the United States. The British also were aiding Indians to rebel against uh, the forces of the U.S. Army in the Northwest Territory. That would include, of course, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin in today's states. And they refused to withdraw from forts that they held there, even after the Treaty of Paris ending the American Revolution in 1783. They argued that the United States owed uh, money to loyalists who had, lost their property, and they were holding on to these areas as a leverage, as leverage against, the American actions. These issues needed to be resolved, and a treaty was worked out by John Jay, sent by Washington, in which the British agreed to withdraw from forts in the Northwest. One of them was at Detroit, and they did withdraw from those forts in 1796. That's the first time that the United States actually gained control over Detroit. Um, U.S. exports to Britain were dealt with favorably, but not to the West Indies. The United States wanted to export things to the West Indies, and Britain interfered with that. There were unresolved issues. The impressment continued. They were still taking Americans off American ships and impressing them into the British Navy. There was a border dispute about where the border was between Maine and Canada. That was not resolved. Slaves that were taken by the British out of the country uh, were an issue because some southern states, especially South Carolina, claimed that they should be paid for those slaves, and Britain refused to do that. And those issues were not resolved. And because of all that, the treaty was not popular. Another factor was that the British were believed to be provoking Native Americans and stirring up trouble in the Northwest Territory. So the treaty was very unpopular in the United States. This is one of the things that led to the division, the deepening division between the two political parties. You'll see here these areas are forts that the British held in American territory. Um, some of them even in upstate New York, and then some in the Northwest Territory, including Detroit. Now, Washington announced that he would not run for re-election, that 2 terms was enough. Uh, and so in 1796, his second term was coming to an end, and we had the first contested election. Washington ran pretty well unopposed. But in 1796, John Adams, the Federalist, Washington's vice president, ran against Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican. Now, Adams won narrowly. Now, at this time, there was not a large popular vote for president. The state legislatures chose electors under the Constitution, and the Electoral College voted narrowly for Adams. Jefferson, however, became vice president. This is an odd situation set up in the original Constitution. It would be changed later, in which they didn't imagine political parties. They just saw individuals running for president. And they said, well, whoever finishes with the highest number will be president, and the second will be vice president. So Jefferson was Adams's vice president, although Adams really excluded him from all the meetings, the communications of his administration. So it was not a very friendly arrangement, to say the least. The Adams administration favored Britain more than France, as we've already discussed. And when they sent a diplomatic mission to France to negotiate items between them that were a problem, the French ministers, who were nicknamed X, Y, and Z, demanded money before they would even talk to the Americans, and this provoked outrage in the United States, and it helped to divide the country between those who were very hostile to France and those who were hostile to Britain. What develops then is what's called a quasi-war, sort of a pseudo-war, a phony war with France over trade issues. France and Britain were at war with each other, and neither side wanted to allow American ships to trade freely on the high seas. Now, Adams, who was hostile to France, convinced Congress to pass the Alien Act of 1798. There were actually three different laws, and they made it harder for immigrants to become citizens. This was especially aimed at French immigrants to the United States. Made it harder for them to become citizens of the U.S. Maybe even more serious to Jefferson's party was the Sedition Act, and it made it illegal to speak or write against the government. Now, that today we would say that's a gross violation of the First Amendment right of free speech. A lot of people believed that then, and this was seen by many as Adams abusing his power. Virginia and Kentucky refused to accept these laws. Kentucky believed they could interpose, they could get in between the laws and their own state. Virginia said they could simply nullify them, meaning wipe them out. These laws are null and void. And that introduces a theory of states' rights, that the states can refuse to obey acts of the federal government. That would be a huge issue in the decades to come. They were not successful in enforcing these ideas, though. The election of 1800 was even more intensely fought. The same two candidates opposed each other. And this time there was no majority in the Electoral College, so the election went to the House of Representatives. Now, this time Jefferson won a comfortable victory, but his vice presidential candidate, Aaron Burr, had the same number of electoral votes, and it had to go to the House for a long and difficult process of choosing the president, which is done by the House of Representatives when there's no uh, majority in the Electoral College. Uh, but it was resolved, and what is important about this election is that it was the first peaceful transition of power in American history. You have one party defeating another party, but the losing party peacefully gave way to the new president, even though they bitterly opposed each other. And that was a very good sign for the future of American government, American representative democracy. Uh, you can follow this link, which is not live here, but it's live in the PDF that is posted on the Moodle site. Now, this strange situation where the president and vice president were chosen in the same election was modified. It was changed by the 12th Amendment, which set up the system that we have today. Um, the electors would now cast separate votes for president and vice president. Um, and both the president and the vice president would require a majority of the voters to be elected. The same electoral college would have one ballot for president and one for vice president. So that situation that happened in 1800 could never happen again. Um, and if there's a tie for the presidency, or no one has a majority, the House would decide that, but the voting would be done by state, with each state getting one vote. And if there's a tie for vice president, where no one gets a majority, then that would be decided by the Senate.